So horror is not the genre I go to most often. I am primarily a fantasy and sci-fi reader, but after reading 3 horror novels in October, I realized it was a genre that I have started to enjoy, and I don't want to wait all the way until October of 2025 to go ahead and pick up some more horror books. I saw Mike over at Mike's Book Reviews and Jake over at Nerd Level Rising making this video, so I thought I would do the same thing and talk about what I plan on being my next 10 horror novel read. As always, I'm super open to any of your suggestions. If you think some of these books aren't going to work for me, or if you have ones that you think are just absolute must-reads, I would love to hear those down in the comments below. But let's go ahead and start my list off strong with an author that I think most people, mostly associate with the horror genre, and that is Stephen King. And the next book I'm actually going to read after my current read is The Shining by Stephen King. This is one of those classic horror novels slash movies really at this point, and it's such a part of pop culture. I don't really think I need to tell you too much about it. Obviously, this is the descent of madness of somebody staying at or being a groundskeeper at a hotel in the off-season. So I think it's in Colorado. I'm not 100% sure. And honestly, Stephen King is an author who could probably take up a majority of this list. I'm going to just kind of keep it to one book. Actually, I'm going to mention one other one. I do also plan on reading The Mist here pretty shortly. It's a pretty short book, so I guess it's technically a novella, but that is another one I plan on reading from him. I plan on reading a lot from King actually in general, but they're not all of the books I want to read from him are technically horror novels, but obviously he's a big player in the space. And The Shining, I looked at a couple lists, tried to find some suggestions. Like I said, I'm new to horror in general, so I looked at a bunch of lists, and The Shining was super high on so many lists, so I'm pretty excited that I had already planned on getting to that here pretty soon. Next up is Little Heaven by Nick Cutter. Nick Cutter has been the past 2 years my headline horror novel author. I read The Troop from him 2 years ago, and then this year I read The Deep. And, I really enjoyed The Troop. The Deep I had a little bit more mixed feelings on, but A Little Piece of Heaven is the last of his 3 horror novels. I think he actually might have a new one coming out in 2024 or 2025, so maybe that could bump this one off the list, but I kind of want to read his last horror novel here. It is not spoken about as highly as The Troop, so I'll be curious on if I'll enjoy it as much. I believe this story has something to do with a family member hiring people to go check in on another family member or something like that. I don't know the exact details of it. This is really just kind of an author pick. I haven't actually looked too much into this individual book too much, but I just kind of want to complete the trifecta of Nick Cutter horror books. The next book up on this list is about demons and possessions and everything like that, and I picked Boys in the Valley because of that reason. When it comes to horror movies, that is the type of subgenre of horror that I am typically drawn to, and it seems like Boys in the Valley might kind of fill that niche. I believe the basic premise is that there is a demon that is exorcised, and then it ends up taking possession of, I don't know if it's a bunch of boys, one boy in a group of a lot of boys, or what exactly goes on there, but it sounds like a pretty good horror novel, and like I said, it really fits what I like to see in horror movies, and so I'm hoping some of that translates over to the page. And you'll actually see that in a couple of my selections here, that my movie tastes definitely pull into my horror reading taste, at least from what I picked out here. I don't know if I'll actually enjoy it as much in book format as I do on the screen, but it is something that I do want to try out, and I think Boys in the Valley will absolutely fit into that niche perfectly. Now, I am somebody who likes a good classic, and so I had to put I Am Legend on this list. I know that it is very different from the movie, but that is one of those movies that I don't think is actually probably that good. I haven't watched it in so long, but it is a movie that I watched a lot as a kid, so I have a lot of nostalgic feelings for it, and Will Smith and everything that happens in that movie. I have heard that it is very different. They're two very different stories, and a lot of things are changed, and that's okay with me. I'm not necessarily wanting it to be exactly like the movie, but this is one of those, it's a classic, and it is something from, I can pull nostalgia from, so that is another very popular one that most people probably are familiar with that I want to get to here soon. Next up on this list is called Slewfoot, and from the little bit of research I did on this book, it takes place sometime in the 1600s. It kind of gave me a Salem witch trial kind of vibe, at least that's what seemed to be kind of going on as a backdrop for it. But basically, once again, coming from what I like to see in movies, it is a demon kind of possession kind of story. I think this one might have to do a little bit more with the demon not necessarily possessing people, but influence people maybe to do bad things or tricking people into doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And it also seems like there might be some horror in the woods, which is another thing that I also like to see in my movies. And as somebody who's just spent a lot of time outside in the woods and in nature and being alone out there and how creepy it can feel, I'm hoping that the setting of this being pre-technology is something that works for me. A lot of times a problem I have with a lot of modern horror is there's so much technology, and they just don't use technology, or the way they use it just doesn't work. And once again, I'm talking about movies. And so I'm hoping that maybe a book that is set so long ago that I'm not necessarily just thinking, well, it's dark, just pull out your phone and turn your flashlight on. You literally have the phone in your pocket. Like, what are we doing here? And I know you're not always going to be thinking logically in some crazy situations, but those little things sometimes do bother me. Or, maybe the use of cameras, or just most people live in such like a populated place now. Like, if you just walk outside, you'll find somebody to help you. And so I do struggle a lot of times with some of that modern horror. So I'm hoping the setting here can kind of carry this book for me. Next up, and this is actually another book that I'm selecting because of the movie, and that is the Amityville Horror. Now, this is a movie that I have actually never watched, but the reason I want to read this book is this is a movie that I can remember my dad saying scared him, which when he told me that as a kid, it like blew my mind. I could never imagine like my dad being scared. He's my dad, right? I'm like a 5-year-old. And there's also some just funny things that there was apparently a house where I'm originally from in Pennsylvania that looked a lot like the house that this is based on. And so that was like one of those creepy things that just kind of influenced me when I was a little kid. This is apparently based on a somewhat true story, so I don't know too much about the true story aspect of this, but I do know that apparently the movie is super scary, and it's kind of one of those classics that honestly I don't actually get hear people talk about it too much, even though to me this is like a prevalent, super scary horror movie. And I don't know if it's just one of those ones that just hasn't stuck in pop culture as much as like The Exorcist, for example. But this is a book that I think might actually scare me more, just because of some of the preconceived feelings I'll have about it from hearing about it when I was a kid so much. Next up is a book that kind of deals with the Jim Crow era of America, and it is called Ring Shout. And I believe the premise here is that all of that hatred and everything ends up producing demons who then become part of like the KKK or something like that. It seems like it might be a little out there, and it might honestly be a little too heavy-handed with some of the political commentary that it has going on it, which sometimes is a hit or miss kind of thing for me. It depends on how much I want to like pay attention to that topic and if there's enough else going on in the story. I don't want it to just be like a lecture about like a bad thing that is bad, but it is a story that or a book that I heard about a while ago on BookTube. I've been meaning to get around to it for quite a long time, but I think it fits nicely into this horror genre, and it just seems like an interesting twist compared to a lot of the other things that I have on this list, because most of it is like demon possession kind of stuff. And while this does still have demons as a big through line here for me, it seems to be dealing with more of a social issue, and I'm kind of interested to see how horror and a social issue kind of combined and work together as one. Next up is from a very popular author. I enjoyed Hyperion from him, and that is Dan Simmons, and I want to read The Terror by him. I'm pretty sure HBO maybe just made a miniseries out of this, and the basic premise of this story is there is a group of sailors who are trying to sail into the Arctic, through the Arctic, something like that, and they end up getting stuck in ice and kind of frozen in place, and they try to survive for as long as they can. And I believe the TV show and this book end up bringing in some supernatural elements. I think this is one of those things that is based on a somewhat true story, and I think this is a book that emphasizes the supernatural elements, even though that thing isn't what happened in real life. But I do think it's an interesting idea to maybe have something happening in the Arctic. I know there's not necessarily a lot of lore about that region because people don't live there, but I do think it's interesting, an interesting premise, and something that there will be a lot of paranoia and mistrust and everything. And I think that can be an interesting setting for a horror novel. Next up is a new book, I think as of 2024, and this is one that speaks to me a little bit as somebody who moved a lot growing up. The idea of like going back to somewhere I used to live just to see it again is something that I think about quite often, and this book is called We Used to Live Here. And the basic premise is that somebody buys a house, a family shows up and say, hey, we used to live here, can we just come in for 15 minutes and look around and just kind of like reminisce? And then apparently that group of people starts to overstay their welcome, and some interesting things start to happen with a somewhat sinister tone. And so like I said, a little bit of this is just because I am somebody who moved a lot, and this idea of like going back and visiting a place again has definitely occurred to my mind. So I'd want to see if this is more supernatural horror, more like real life crime horror, or what's going to go on here. But it's just something that kind of speaks to me personally, and I think is an interesting premise to have a horror setting in. And the last book on this list is Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. Now, this is an interesting one because I read a somewhat horror novel from this author a little while ago, and it was actually one of the complaints I had about that book. I wish I could remember the name. I can't off the top of my head. I'll try to remember to put it on screen. But the problem I had with that book is it felt like it wanted to be so many things at one time. I think that a lot of the suspenseful elements that S.A. Barnes was able to put into that book were fantastic, but it kind of fell down in the latter half because it didn't know what it wanted to be. Did it want to be a sci-fi book? Did it want to be a horror book? Did it want to be something else? And with this book, I believe this is marketed as just a horror novel. I think, the strength of that book that can be brought into this book, I think it could end up being a really good time if the plot can stay straight, which isn't necessarily the case, but I am at least interested enough because, like I said, the good parts of that previous book from this author were really good. But those are some of my next horror reads that I plan to do. As somebody who is a mood reader, this list could absolutely change, and I would absolutely love to see some of your suggestions down below in the comments. Those are absolutely something that could destroy this list and make me change it up pretty well. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.